Hi, and welcome to the ASS Capacity Plus multi-site technical webinar. I'm Pero, and I'll be your host today. Some general housekeeping during the webinar. This webinar will last no more than 1 hour. All participants will be muted throughout the webinar, and this presentation can be accessed via our YouTube channel at the end if you've missed it or you'd like to watch it again. So today is the last in our series of technical webinars, where we'll be looking at Capacity Plus multi-site. If you've missed any of the previous 2 webinars, please go and have a look on our YouTube channel and you can watch it again. So what we'll be looking at today is the typical use cases for a Capacity Plus multi-site system, the design considerations in fleet mapping, and we'll also see how the repeaters and subscriber radios are programmed. So what is Capacity Plus multi-site? Capacity Plus multi-site is a multi-site version of Capacity Plus single site. So before, in Capacity Plus single site, you had one standalone site. With Capacity Plus multi-site, you can have multiple sites all networked together to give you a wide area network. And you can have up to 15 sites, just like in IP Site Connect. And within those 15 sites, you will have one master repeater on one of the sites, and the rest of all of the repeaters will be peer repeaters. You can have a total of 20 devices on one site, and that's up to 8 trunk repeaters or 16 voice time slots, and up to 11 data revert repeaters. But if you have a combination of the 2, you can't exceed 12 repeaters. You can also have up to 255 talk groups, and subscribers can roam automatically between the sites in the system, just like with IP Site Connect. The master repeater contains a rudimentary fleet map that lists all of the sites in the system and a list of the talk groups and which sites they should be networked to. So this is something new that we haven't seen before. In the master repeater of a Capacity Plus multi-site system, there is a list of all the sites and also a list of the talk groups. And this is to give you more control over the system. We will look at that in more detail next. So the main advantage of Capacity Plus multi-site is added subscriber capacity. And that is because you can now have multiple repeaters per site and also multiple sites. You can use it where there's a large number of people that need voice communications over a wider coverage area. And it could be places like manufacturing plants with multiple locations, airlines, schools and universities, large retail, shopping centers, and so on. And as with IP Site Connect, you can also link different frequency bands together on the various sites. So you could have a mixture of VHF and UHF sites. When we look at the master repeater programming, there is a talk groups section in the CPS. And talk groups, the talk groups list must be populated with all the talk groups that will be used in the system. And these IDs must match what is programmed into the subscriber radios. This window is used to designate which sites are wide area talk groups. And if slots are not available at all the sites, then the call will be declined. So if you look at the list of sites there, each list or each site has a site ID, and then you can select which of the sites you want the talk group to be a part of. And this is an easy way to make subscriber radios part of certain sites. And what that means is you can have the programming for all of the subscriber radios the same, and then you can select which sites they are part of in the master repeater. That makes life a lot easier because you can keep the programming for the subscribers the same, and this gives you a lot of control where you can just make the changes in one area, and that will then be propagated through to the rest of the system. There is also a sites section in the programming, and this is where you add your sites. So if you have a number of sites, let's say 12, you will add them each manually in this section. Now the master repeater must have a list of the sites and the talk groups populated. And you'll see there's also neighbor sites. And this may be populated. And in fact, it should be populated under certain circumstances. So what constitutes a neighbor site? A site can only be classed as a neighbor if there is RF overlapping coverage between the sites. So if you have a site where you've got overlapping RF coverage, that site will be a neighbor. And you need to set that site as a neighbor. If the site is not within RF coverage, then it will not be considered a neighbor, and you do not need to fill it in this section. And this has to do with the handover of the radios between the sites. It makes the roaming more efficient, and it just ensures that your radio hands over to the neighbor site that it expects to see in the list. The capacity plus settings for the beacon duration and interval, rest channel IP and UDP must be configured identically in each repeater at a site. And this is the same for capacity plus, where all of the repeaters had the same beacon duration, beacon interval, rest channel IP and rest channel UDP port. So these settings will be different in the different sites, but for each site, this should be identical in all of the repeaters. So then let's look at voice lists and site lists. In capacity plus single site, we had the introduction of voice lists that the radios used to scan for available channels. Voice lists are also used in capacity plus multi-site, but now we also have site lists because we've got more than one site. So as before, subscribers will have all the trunk channels programmed into their channel pool. Trunk channels are added to the capacity plus voice list, which is the same as in a standalone capacity plus single site. Site lists are then created to reference a specific voice list for each site, and this is new. So for each system, you will have to create site lists. We will look at this in the subscriber programming afterwards. And each capacity plus multi-site system personality references a site list. You need to select the right site list for the system, because if you don't, then the system will not work properly and your radios will not scan to the correct channels. Subscribers will also roam based on the RSSI setting in the site list. And this is the same as before, but the RSSI setting is now just in a different place. So if we look in a subscriber radio code plug, you can see in the channel zone setup, there is the site list that you need to select. Now before in capacity plus single site, that was called the voice list. The voice list is now referenced in a different section, and you have to select the correct site list in the programming. And if we look at the second half of the screen, you can see that the only difference between this and the capacity plus single site is the RX group list has been removed. This will now be found in your site lists, which we will look at a bit later on. But the rest is all the same. You still select your contact name, the power level, the admit criteria, and so on. Everything else stays the same as before. So this is the capacity plus site list. As you can see in this configuration, there's 7 sites. All the sites need to be added manually to the site list, and a voice list needs to be specified for the correct site. So the only mandatory field is the voice list. All the rest can be left default, or you don't have to select a value. Again, we will see how this works afterwards. So this is the topology of a capacity plus multi-site system. It works a little different than IP Site Connect, because with IP Site Connect, you could have all of the repeaters on the same LAN. This is not the case with capacity plus multi-site. Each site in a capacity plus multi-site system needs to sit behind its own router and have its own network. This is so that the traffic on each site can be routed properly between the repeaters at each site and also to the repeaters on the other sites. Here you can see we've got 2 sites with 3 repeaters each. There's one master repeater, the rest will all be peer repeaters. Each site sits behind its own switch and router, and it's connected to a network, which is then connected to a host PC with RDAC running. You could have a host PC with any compatible software or program that works with Motor Turbo, as long as it sits behind its own network and it's connected to the Capacity Plus multi-site system. So fleet mapping, we've looked at fleet mapping before in the 2 previous webinars. It's exactly the same. You need to determine how the radio communications for each user group of an organization is controlled. You need to decide which talk groups are assigned to which users. You also need to decide if the dispatcher radios will have more privileges, more features and more functions than the rest of the user groups. And you also need to decide on the features and the licenses that are available for the system. Channel frequency considerations. Again, this is something we've looked at before. So is it a new system, or is it a system that is being converted from maybe a conventional system to a Capacity Plus multi-site system? Do you need to apply for new frequencies, or do you have some frequencies already? Have you done your propagation studies? So have site surveys been done? The site surveys for a Capacity Plus multi-site system will be more involved because now you've got more than one site. So this needs to be done properly to ensure that the correct coverage is obtained for the customer. And also possible interference issues might be harder to track down because you might now have more sites than before. So this is something that we've not looked at before, channel loading considerations. So you need to decide how big the system needs to be, how many repeaters you need for the amount of users on the system. And some of the questions you may ask is how many users will be used on the system? Will the system add new voice and data users in the future? So if you recommend a certain system for a customer, always keep in mind future expansion. They might add new users that use voice and or data. So you might want to give them extra capacity, that will accommodate more users in the future. Customers may need to add more channels if they add larger volumes of subscribers in the future. Some customers might decide that the system will be big enough as it is. They might not want to plan for future expansion due to cost and so on, but it's good if you at least give them the option. A Capacity Plus multi-site ideally can support 100 subscribers per slot. And this all depends on how they use the radios and the system. You could have 100 subscribers that make a lot of calls in an hour or during a full day. But then you can also have an instance where you've got 500 subscribers, for instance, and they make a lot less calls. So it all depends on the application. Adding more data radios or shortening the GPS update period could also drive the need for more revert slots or the need for enhanced GPS on the system. So if you have a user that uses voice only on the system, they've only got people using the radios for voice communications, and they decide later they would like to add GPS radios, then you would likely need some data revert repeaters added to the system. And looking at the requirements, you might ask who will be using the system. So what type of customer is it? What type of industry? By that you could possibly work out how much the system will be in use, for how long, how will they use the system, and these can help you plan the system in advance. And you still need to follow the same logic as programming a conventional system, because to a subscriber radio, it's still a radio system, and it's not much different in that sense. And then after identifying the users within the system and their interrelations, the next step is to determine system capacity. So this is one of the most important aspects of deciding on a Capacity Plus multi-site system, and any radio system indeed. So how many channels do they need? If you don't specify enough channels, then the radio system might be busy all the time, and that's not ideal. Similarly, if you spec a system that's got too many channels, the system won't be busy at any times because you've got enough capacity, but the customer might question why they've had to spend so much money on unnecessary repeaters for, the added capacity. You need to look at migration plans, frequency licensing, RF coverage, and digital repeater loading, and these are all factors in the planning of a new system. So features that are not supported in Capacity Plus multi-site, it does not support dynamic site assignment, call queuing, priority, and preemption. So these are features of a Tier 3 system. You get these features in systems like Capacity Max, where there's a control channel and a trunking controller that can deal with, the calls on each of the sites. This is not supported in any Tier 2 system. And then Capacity Plus multi-site does provide higher priority on all calls and emergency calls. And when it says higher priority, that doesn't mean that if the whole system is busy and you make an all call, it will actually, kick someone off of one of the channels and then let you make the call. It just means that an all call and emergency calls will treat the channel as impolite. So you cannot set a Capacity Plus multi-site subscriber radio to be impolite in the CPS. You always need to be polite, but in the instance of an all call and emergency calls, it will then treat the channel as impolite so that it has a chance to send the all call or the emergency call. That still doesn't mean that all the users will receive it the first time round, but it gives you a better chance. So we've come to the end of the presentation. We now have some time to look at the CPS, the code plugs of the subscriber radios and the repeaters, and then hopefully once we've looked at that, you should be able to set up a Capacity Plus multi-site system. So here we have the code plug of a peer repeater. If we go through the settings from start to finish, we will see what we need to set up for a Capacity Plus multi-site system. So my radio alias, I've called this peer slot 1 and slot 2 because this is the peer repeater. This is actually my site 2 as well, and we will see where we specify this in a bit. The radio ID, just remember that in a Capacity Plus system, your ID cannot be more than 65335. The timers can stay default, which I've left default in this instance, and you can set your TX power level. Then if we look on the network, as before, you have to give the repeater its own IP address. In this instance, it's 192.168.11.100. You need a gateway IP because there's a router on every site, and my gateway IP is 192.168.11.1, and you also need to give it a subnet mask. And then if we look at the link establishment, you need to reference the master IP address. You also need to set the link type, which in this instance is a peer. You need to set or reference the master's UDP port, and you also have to give the repeater its own UDP port. So the networking works in exactly the same way as the networking in IP Site Connect. And for those that might have missed it, we can look at the networking again in a bit more detail. So here we have a drawing of the networking in a Capacity Plus multi-site system. As I said, it's exactly the same, or almost exactly the same as in IP Site Connect. So let's go through it again. You can set the network up in two fundamental different ways. Number one, you can connect to the WAN IP address of the master site, which is referenced in the peer repeater. Or you can set up a VPN and you can point towards the master repeater's local IP address. So since this was set up in the lab, I've used the WAN IP address of 192.168.1.10, and that is the IP address that's referenced in my peer repeater. Because I'm using the WAN IP address of the site router, I need to do some port forwarding. And this is because once the traffic arrives at the site router, the router needs to know what to do with that traffic, and it needs to forward the UDP traffic to the master repeater. In IP Site Connect, all we did was we port forwarded the traffic on the UDP port for the master repeater to the master repeater's local IP address. But now we have a REST channel as well, so we do need to port forward the UDP traffic on the REST channel for the master repeater to the REST channel IP address. So you just create two simple rules in the router setup where you do port forwarding from the UDP port to the master's IP address and also from the REST channel UDP port to the REST channel IP address. You'll notice that I did the same for the peer site. This is not necessary, but it's good practice. And this is because the link establishment happens in the direction from the peer site to the master site. The second instance is you can create VPNs between all of your sites. And since a VPN essentially puts all of the networks on the same LAN, you can then communicate with the master repeater via its local IP address. So if you use VPNs between the sites, there's no need to do any port forwarding. So now we're back at the peer repeater's code plug. If we look at the Capacity Plus section at the bottom, this is where you specify the site ID. So this is my site 2, and therefore you specify site ID 2. For each site, you will have a unique ID. If you had multiple repeaters per site, each of those repeaters would have the same site ID. So if I had 3 repeaters on my site 2, those 3 repeaters would all have site ID 2. The site alias, you can just give it a description that describes the site that you're on. And then the beacon duration, beacon interval, REST channel IP, and the REST channel UDP port will be identical for all of the repeaters on the same site. As you can see, my REST channel IP is something completely different. It can be anything you want, as long as they are the same, because as I've said before, the REST channel IP is used to control the REST channel internally, so it doesn't really matter what IP address you give it. Just make sure that the REST channel UDP port is also unique in the system. If we look at the channel zone setup, so before in a Capacity Plus system, we would have added a Capacity Plus channel, but because this is Capacity Plus multi-site, you will notice that the channel icon looks different, and that's because now you need to add a Capacity Plus linked channel. And if we look inside the channel setup, you'll see it looks exactly the same as with Capacity Plus single site. You give it a channel name, you select the color code, and you also have the site preference level and the slot IDs, the same as before. So the first repeater on every site will have slot ID 1 and 2. So you might have 5 different sites, and because the first repeater on each site is unique for that site, you will give it a slot ID of 1 and 2. The second repeater for every site will be slot ID 3 and 4, and so on. So it's exactly the same as Capacity Plus single site, but you now just do this for all of the sites in the system. And then you add your frequencies, set your power level, and that's it done for the peer repeater. So here we have the master repeater programming. If we look at the general settings, you can see I called this master slot 1 and slot 2. It's got a unique radio ID, and the site timers are default and the same as with my site 2. Power levels are the same, and the rest I've left as default. If we now look at the network, you can see that my master's own IP address is different from the master IP address I use to reference in my peer repeater. And that is because I'm using the WAN address for the site router on the master site. The only time you will reference the master repeater's internal or local IP address is if you have VPNs between the sites. So my master's IP address is 192.168.10.100. My gateway is 192.168.10.1, and I've got a default subnet mask. If we look at the link establishment, you will see that even though this is the master repeater, you still need to reference the WAN IP address in this field here. So if we look at the network again, you'll notice that the IP address is not the same. And again, that is because I'm referencing the WAN address of the site router. So this is my repeater's local IP address. And this here is the IP address of the master site router. The master UDP port is 50,011 and will be repeated because this is the master repeater. Now under capacity plus, you will see that my site ID is now 1 because this is my site 1. And if I had more repeaters on the site, all of those repeaters would have site ID 1. And again, the beacon duration, the interval, the rest channel IP, and the rest channel UDP port will all be the same for this site, but it will be unique. So this rest channel IP will not be the same as the rest channel IP on any of the other sites, but for all the repeaters in site 1, it will be the same, as will be the UDP port for the rest channel. So now if we look at the sites section in the programming, this needs to be filled out in the master repeater only. If your link type is set to master, you will have access to these settings here, and you'll be able to add your sites. If your link type is set to peer, this will be grayed out and you won't be able to set anything in this window here. So since this is the master repeater and you have to fill this out, you can see I've added my 2 sites manually. So it's very simple. All you do is click on the add or plus button and it will add another site. You can also see that I've got 6 neighbor sites here that I can populate, and because my site 2 and site 1 have RF coverage overlapping, I can make them neighbors of each other. So site 1's neighbor will be site 2 and site 2's neighbor will be site 1. This can get a little bit more involved if there are many sites, but it's still easy enough because hopefully not all of the sites will be overlapping RF-wise. Then if we look at the talk group section, so these talk groups need to match up with what is in your subscriber radio. Otherwise, the master repeater won't be able to control these talk groups because they don't exist in the subscriber programming. So in your subscriber radio, you should have the same talk group IDs of 101, 102, and 103. And you can see that you can select which sites these talk groups must be a part of. Talk group 101 is part of site 1 and site 2, so this will be a wide area call. Talk group 102 is only part of site 2, so when anyone on talk group 102 makes a call, only users on site 2 will be able to talk between themselves. And the same for ID 103, this time they will only be able to use site 1. If you planned on only having wide area talk groups, you could tick the all wide area talk groups box here, and you can see that it grays out the section below. So now all of the talk groups in your subscriber radios will be treated as wide area talk groups. And if we look at the channel zone, again we have a capacity plus linked channel in there. Channel name, which is master slot 1 and slot 2. The color code, the preference level, and you'll see that the slot ID is 1 and 2 for this repeater, as it was for the peer repeater. And just to remind you, the first repeater on every site will have slot ID 1 and 2. And then the frequencies, and you have to add the power, or select the power rather, and then that is it done for the master profile. So here we have a subscriber code plug. This is for a DP4801E. Let's have a look at the settings from start to finish. If we look at the general settings, as before, you give it a radio alias, a unique radio ID. Be sure to stay within the ID range for Capacity Plus. And then all of the other settings can be left as default. You can change them if you need to. I mean, there's quite a few things that you can set. It won't have an effect on whether this will work as a Capacity Plus multi-site radio, so you can leave it as default. Again, you don't need to set the network settings in a subscriber radio because all the networking is done by the repeaters. Next, if we look at the contacts, you will see that as with Capacity Plus single site, you just add Capacity Plus contacts. So there is no option to add it as a Capacity Plus linked or a Capacity Plus multi-site contact. So you will add these contacts as normal Capacity Plus contacts. It will be the same for single site or multi-site. And as you can see, these talk group IDs correspond with what I've set in the master repeater. So 103, 101, and 102. So these three talk groups are controlled from within the repeater in the talk group section where I could make them part of certain sites or all of the sites. If you look at the RX group list, again, you'll add them as normal Capacity Plus RX group lists because there is no option for Capacity Plus multi-site. You can see I've added my RX group list to correspond with my contacts. And if we then look at the channel pool, you will see that as before, you add your repeater channels in the channel pool, same as in a Capacity Plus single site system. And again, you'll notice that these are Capacity Plus channels, not Capacity Plus linked. You cannot specify a Capacity Plus linked channel in the channel pool. So you will add these channels as normal Capacity Plus channels, and all of your site, different sites repeaters will be in this section here as one big list. So if you had, let's say, a 10 site Capacity Plus multi-site system, and on each of the sites you had 3 repeaters, then all of the repeaters on all of the sites would be added as one long list in the channel pool here. Since I've only got 2 repeaters, I've only got the 2 entries in the channel pool. And you'll see this is my master repeaters details. And again, there's nothing that you can set apart from the color code and the frequency. And then this is my peer repeater, which is my site 2 repeater. And again, you can see it's only the frequency and the color code. So once you've added all of your site channels to the channel pool, you then need to look at your Capacity Plus voice list. And this is what can confuse people sometimes. So in Capacity Plus single site, you will have your site list and you can add all of your repeaters. What you need to remember in Capacity Plus multi-site is that you need a site list for each of the sites. So if you have a 5-site system, you need to add 5 individual voice lists in your Capacity Plus subscriber radio. So if we look at site 1, you will see that as before in Capacity Plus single site, all of the channels in the channel pool will appear in the available section on the left here. Now don't be tempted to add all of the channels in as members on the right hand side, because you only need to add members for that specific site. So since I've got 2 sites, I will only add the master repeater as a member of site 1, because that's the only repeater I physically have on site 1. If I had 3 repeaters on site 1, those 3 repeaters would have been added in the section here, and the rest of the system's repeaters would still be left in the available section. You need to make sure that you don't get these mixed up. And as before, they also need to correspond to the channel IDs, which is why I've called mine master 1 plus 2. If I had more repeaters, they would be called 3 plus 4, 5 plus 6, and so forth. If we now look at site 2, you can see that I've only got 1 peer repeater added as a member, and that's because there's only 1 repeater on site 2, and that is a peer repeater. Again, if I had multiple repeaters on site 2, they would be added in this section here as members, and they would also need to correspond to the channel IDs. So once you've completed your voice list, you need to look at the site list. So the very last one, capacity plus site list. This is new. You don't do this in capacity plus single site, but this must be done for any capacity plus multi-site system. You will notice that I've only got 1 list under capacity plus site list, because you need 1 list for each system, not for each site. For the sites, you add them individually in your voice list, but you only have 1 capacity plus site list. And within the site list, you will add all of your different sites in 1 table here. So if I had 5 sites, I would add all of them in here, and they would be site 1 to 5. Since I've only got 2 sites, these are the 2 sites that you can see. You give it a site alias, make sure it corresponds with the actual site name of the repeater. And then the only thing you need to select is the voice list. So you can see I've got the 2 voice lists there, and that's the ones I created before. They need to correspond to the correct site. So make sure that you don't set the voice list for site 2 to site 1. Just make sure that they are in the right order. Now, you can set the RX group list, because you can see I've created these 3 RX group lists. If you do set them though, you will be limited to whichever group list you select. So what I do is I leave it as none. And then what that means is when you come to add channels in your channel zone, you can have multiple channels with different contacts. And because this is set to none, the contact will automatically use the corresponding RX group list. So if that doesn't make a lot of sense, let's have a look at the channel zone. So once you've added your capacity plus site list, you can then add your channels in your channel zone. And you can see now I've added capacity plus linked channels in here. Make sure that they are the correct sort or the correct type of channel, because if you add these as normal capacity plus single site channels, it won't work properly. So if we look at the channel zone setup, so this looks the same as capacity plus single site, although now you have an option here for auto roam. Make sure that this is enabled, because you want your radios to roam automatically between the different sites. If you untick this option, your radios will not roam, and it won't work properly for, as a multi-site system. Then you have your site list. Before in capacity plus single site, you had the voice list, and now you have the site list. Make sure you select the right one. The beacon interval is the same as before. You can leave that as default. Just make sure that it corresponds with the repeater's beacon intervals. And now you can see, you can select the contact name. Before in capacity plus single site, you could select the RX group list in this section here. But because it is now contained within the site list, you cannot set it in this section here. And because I left my RX group list as none before, I can now add multiple channels in the channel zone. And if I select any contact, it will then use the corresponding RX group list for that channel. So if we look at the second channel in the channel list, you will see that I've got group call 2 selected now. I do not need to specify the RX group list because my group list is set to none. And that's the same in all of the motor turbo systems. You don't have to specify an RX group list, because if you don't specify any RX group list, it will automatically use the group list that corresponds to the contact name. So I can add multiple channels on different contact names here, and it will work properly. And it will just mean that my site list will be a lot neater and a lot less congested, because I didn't specify the RX group list for every single contact. If we look at the rest of the channel setup, it's the same as before. The site list is site list 1, and this will be the same for all of the subscriber radios. Auto roam is enabled, and the rest of the settings are the same. Admit criteria, remember you cannot be impolite, so you cannot select always. It has to be either channel free or color code free. And once you set up all your channels, the system is ready to go, and hopefully you should now have a working system. So with this, we've come to the end of this webinar. I hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, if you try and set up a system and you've got any problems, please do reach out and I will see where I can help. Thank you and goodbye.